Secrets of the C-Suite, the podcast, is for anyone interested in leadership and the wins, losses, and lessons of being an executive. We are two women who have successfully navigated C-Suite roles and are sharing our experiences. We will be bringing on guests to tell their stories and want to spark honest conversation and discussion, which may include swearing and lots of laughs. Join us on this adventure.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Secrets of the C-Suite. I'm Susan Sutherland, and with me is Juliet Clothier and our guest, Shireen McSpadden, who we'll talk to in just a minute. Hi, Juliet. How are you today?
I'm good, Susan. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. It's for our audience, it's still the end of 2024 as we're recording this. So for me, I'm thinking ahead to 2025 and wondering what I want my January and February to look and feel like. Well, I'm still muddling through the end of 24. How about you, Juliet?
Yeah, I like to start the year with something I call Dampuary, which is not a complete no alcohol situation, but just a little more mindfulness, because as the month of December rolls on, suddenly it's like there's a party and then there's a weeknight thing. And I'm not usually a weeknight drinker, but hey, it's the holidays. So I know that I'm going to be needing that Dampuary. So hopefully that comes to fruition in January. And yeah, I have a trip planned, which is kind of crazy, going to Chicago in the middle of January, which
is crazy.
I have friends there who don't understand why, but it's just an opportunity to go and be in the cold for a weekend and stay in a nice hotel. So that's what I'm doing.
I forgot to mention to our listeners out there that I'm recording this in sunny South Africa. It is late spring, and it was in the high 80s today where I live. So when you're in Chicago freezing, I will be, warm. Just saying.
You're in forever summerland. You're summer in Northern California and summer in South Africa. So that's nice.
I feel like it's time to bring on our guest, don't you, Juliet?
Sure.
So I'm very excited about our guest today. Her name is Shireen McSpadden, and she is the Executive Director of the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing for the City and County of San Francisco. She's held this position for nearly 4 years. Her experience and connection to communities helps the department meet its strategic goals of serving our most vulnerable residents. Prior to this role, Shireen served as Executive Director for the Department of Disability and Aging Services for the City and County of San Francisco. This is a topic that both Juliet and I are eager to hear more about. Shireen has over 30 years' experience providing services to people with disabilities and seniors in both the nonprofit and public sectors. In 2020, she was recognized for her anti-ageism work by Time magazine, named as one of 16 people and groups fighting for a more equitable America. She has served on several boards and committees, including the Glide Foundation, the San Francisco Palliative Care Work Group, the California Association of Area Agencies on Aging, and USAGing. I don't know how to pronounce that, Shireen. You'll correct me in just a second, I'm sure. We are delighted to have you with us today, Shireen. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I am really looking forward to this conversation. Thanks to both of you.
Yeah. Lovely to see you and have you. Even though our audience can only hear you, we get to see you. We thought we would start with a very broad question about you and your leadership and career. And it's, how did you choose your career path? Or did it, like for many of us, choose you?
It's so funny that you should ask me that question, because I actually talk sometimes with groups of young people and aspiring managers and leaders, and I often tell them that my career completely chose me, as a way of telling them that people come to leadership and come up in their careers in very different ways. And I think, I grew up in a household where my parents were very dedicated to service. And we spent a lot of time in my family talking about that and thinking about what that means. And so I had that value early in life, but I had no idea what it would mean for me and how it would look different from the way it looked for my parents. And I literally fell into the various things that I'd been involved in throughout my career, from starting to work with young people when I was a teenager and just got asked to work in this day camp in the summers, and I realized I really liked working with kids. When I was in college, I kind of thought, well, I can do psychology and social work because those things seem like they will lead me in the right direction, but I didn't really understand what that meant at the time. And then once I got out of college, I really started out on this social services track and just worked my way up into leadership in social services organizations, and eventually along the way got my master's in nonprofit administration to kind of help give me a little bit more of the theoretical side of leadership in that sector. And so things just kind of spiraled into what I kind of, in my career with the city, which has been the last 21 years of my life. And it just happened, and it just evolved, and it's kind of cool. At the time, I thought, well, I don't know what I'm doing, and I don't have a plan. But then I realized, that's okay too.
Yeah. Yeah. I've described my career was sort of similar in the sense of feeling like it chose me and things presented. And the way I talk about it with young people is I'm an opportunist, and without the negative connotations, right? And it sounds like you've got that same tendency. Opportunities appeared and it either lit you up or it didn't. And if it lit you up, you just said, okay, this is what we're doing next. Is that a fair characterization?
That's fair. And I think part of it is just putting things out into the universe about what you think you want to do next, and opening up those possibilities in your mind, and sometimes they come to you.
I think it's, I love that idea of kind of paying attention to what's going on around you and trying things on and feeling things out and going for that, what you're putting out into the universe. I think that is so important because you're telling the universe that you're ready for whatever it is, and being willing to say yes to opportunities when you don't always know what it means to say yes, but just it feels right in the moment. And I think that's a big piece of how successful people move along in their careers, is just being willing to say, I'm not sure, but I know I can figure it out. And it seems like the right path to me. It sounds really, really exciting. And that you have been in the city for 21 years, in the city of San Francisco. It is a very complicated place. I know that it's city and county of San Francisco. So working in there's dual systems there, correct? Where you're in.
Correct. There's a county system and there's a city system. I think you'd think, unlike counties like Los Angeles, where there's so many cities and there's a county, right? There's two very different structures. You would think that it would be seamless because we are city and county in San Francisco, and that isn't definitely not the case. It is still very, very complicated. So you'll hear more about that.
Like that. Yeah, I'm really glad Juliet asked that question, because I've always known San Francisco was a city and a county in one, but hadn't thought about the fact that there's administrative or systemic things that happen because it's both. Doesn't mean they're the same.
Right.
Yeah. So how did you make the transition from being focused on aging and aid services for the aged into homelessness? How did that transition happen for you?
Yeah, so I spent 30 years of my life serving older adults. I started out as a case manager and volunteer manager with a small organization in Bayview Hunters Point in San Francisco. And I just really loved the population that I was working with, and just had the opportunities to move up in that organization and eventually become the executive director. And then transitioned to working for the city back in 2003. And again, I just loved working in the Department of Disability and Aging Services, had the opportunity to really help shape the work of that department in the 18 years I was there, or almost 18 years I was there. And I feel like that is my passion in so many ways, is working with older people and really making their lives better and finding, it growing old isn't popular. It's not sexy, so to speak. And, it's also really, really important that people get to live their best lives throughout their lives. And so I was very passionate about that. During COVID, I was deployed to work as part of the emergency response to COVID for the city. And I ended up running basically the food coordination. So we were looking at ways to make sure that people and communities who were hungry were getting food, if they were isolated because of COVID, if they were older, and if they were poor, right? Just really looking or kids. I mean, we were looking at the best ways to coordinate all the food response and all the donations coming in. And I ended up doing that, as well as being the executive director of the department, it was a lot of work, because there was this huge national and state and local focus also on keeping older adults safe in that climate. And I think because of that, I was exposed more to the mayor's office than I had been before. The Department of Disability and Aging flies a little under the radar, as you might imagine. And after COVID, in 2021, the mayor's office called me and asked me if I would be willing to even think about going to the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing. And they basically said, you've been a department head for several years. We've seen your leadership and your management style, and would you consider it? And that was flattering. And also they were really desperate to find somebody at that time, because nobody would take that job. And my first inclination was to say no. I have really thought that I would dedicate, the rest of my career to aging. And, again, I was very involved at many levels, including the national level and advocacy on the Hill and things like that. And then I thought about it, and I had realized that I had been thinking for a couple of years about what my next move was going to be and where I was going to go. And I kind of thought I would go back to nonprofit and run a nonprofit. And I thought, actually, I feel like I could take the knowledge that I've gained and the experience that I've gained from the Department of Disability and Aging and apply that in the new department. And I knew just from hearing about it that the staff at the Department of Homelessness really needed a leader who could both listen to them, provide some structure for the department, bring in some team members who are missing, and really just help make the staff feel more supported. I also knew that there was a lot of consternation, particularly among staff of color in the department, about equity, about diversity and inclusion, about how that would work within the department, as well as how it was really working in the community, knowing that 40% of the homeless population in San Francisco is Black, and only 5% of our overall population is Black, right? So there was and that's just one stat, and I could give you many, but really thinking about how I could use some of my experience and skills to help strengthen the team and really, continue to serve the people in San Francisco who are experiencing homelessness. And so I said yes, and then that was in April of 2021, and I've been with this department since.
That's amazing. I mean, that department is so complex. As our listeners must have heard, even if you're not locally from the Bay Area, just homelessness in San Francisco is such a hot button item, and it's very complicated. And I know that you have made a lot of change and a lot of success. And I want to get to that in a minute, but I do want to go back to talking about aging and palliative care and your passion for that, because I've learned so much about that from a friend of mine who's been working in it. I think did some work for your department. And she's really taught me a lot about how we can help people age gracefully and with dignity and with choices. Because I think one of the things that I didn't quite understand is all the things that we should be talking about as we're getting older, and what choices we want and how we want our lives to end. And it's and nobody wants to talk about it. So let's talk about it here. But I think it's important.
Sure. And, I guess just frame that by a little bit by saying, when we think about aging in US society, at least, we think about anything from like 50 and up to 60 to 65 and up. But, 50 is when you can join AARP, I guess, right? So, I'm 60 and about to be 61, and I still don't, I don't think like senior citizen applies to me, so there's just so much range between the age of 50 and the age of 103. I just was at the singing of Happy Birthday for somebody who's 103, and I'm thinking, this is a 50-year range we're talking about. And so it's really, there's a lot to be done with respect to advocacy and education in our country about what it means to age. And it can be anything from people actually want to work often and have the right to work, as long as they can be fully engaged in that work environment and do the work that they're there to do, right? But there are also people who want to do very different things, and there are people who age earlier and faster than other people. And so it's just really a range of choices. As you said, Juliet, you need to really be able to meet people where they are. And one of my former bosses in aging basically said, we need to think about how do people want to live their best lives, whether they're 75 or whether they're 50 or whether they're 100 and or whether they're 20. And so one of the things that's really important in that is thinking about how people want to be taken care of as they age and they start to become less able to do things on their own. And what does that mean when they, end up with a chronic condition? Again, how do they want to make those choices with those around them who care about them, or their caregivers, even in hospitals and the medical system? So those are conversations that we really spend a lot of time having with people. And when I was the head of the palliative care task force for San Francisco, we had a lot of conversations about how we could improve systems in San Francisco to better make those choices or have people make those choices for themselves, right? It's often that people don't get asked, and we start to, infantilize older people and tell them what they need. And instead, what we really need to do is work with people early on to understand that these are things that you're going to face at some point, or very well may face, and start thinking about how you want your end of life to be. Who do you want around you? What do you think is important spiritually? What do you think is important in terms of medical intervention and all of those things? And we just often don't have those conversations. The other really important piece of that is different cultures have those conversations in different ways. And so in San Francisco, we've done a lot of work with, and basically because we've heard from, I'm not saying like this in, like we've done this work with you, but, the Asian American community thinks about these things really differently from like a Latino community or the Black communities that we have represented in San Francisco. So it's really important to really think about all of that when you're planning systems. And I'd say that about a lot of different parts of the aging services world, but certainly that's one of them.
I can see where it ties to homelessness. And I know we met when I worked at Glide, and you were a board member there at Glide. And I learned so much at that point in time. And a lot of people who were using and getting access to systems and services through Glide were older people and people who, that's something that I don't think we think about a lot. I think, Social Security, we think that's it. That's all people need and they'll be fine. And realizing that, of course, living in the Bay Area, Social Security is not going to cut it. And people end up leaving work, as you talked about, they could still work, but maybe they are kind of forced out of something. And they end up in a situation where they need more support than Social Security and Medicare can give them. And what are we doing to get ahead of that and to think about that? And I think that's so important because it does tie into homelessness, because some of them end up in homeless and unhoused situations because of just the way the system doesn't work for them.
Nationally, the fastest growing segment of the homeless population is people 50 and older. And so, when you think about, we often have thought that Social Security covers everything that people need, and it doesn't. And so what happens often is people, especially when you think about gig workers and other folks, have really been piecing jobs together and trying to make things work. One disabling condition can knock at least one of those jobs out for them. And then all of a sudden they find that they don't have enough money to pay their rent. Or older folks end up having to make choices between their medications and their rent and their food, and their cable bill, which is often the way that they connect with the outside world, And so there's just a lot of things to think about. And when we think about, advocacy, again, people don't get that interested in what it means to have not be resourced enough in the last third or even more of your life. And so there's a lot of need for advocacy to really shore up systems like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and then really think about how to work with people who are younger, thinking about what is your future going to look like and how do you plan for that?
I think about young people and getting young people engaged in politics in general and getting people to run, getting people to kind of take the same career path you took, and how, I don't think it's something that is attractive as it was when I was coming up, and you and I are similar age, just that a government job was very stable and, and are you finding, enough people wanting to join the government workforce to kind of help carry on this work?
Government jobs are still fairly attractive. I do think it depends on what category of government job. What I think is challenging is to really get people who are interested in serving older people. And yet that's where we know a lot of work is going to be needed in the next generation, really. I mean, if you think about caregivers, if you think about geriatricians and gerontologists and, all of those folks, I think there's a lack of interest, and this has been a challenge for this sector for a while. Just kind of figuring out how to recreate that interest and create incentives for people to join this work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that too, when you start learning about palliative care, you really realize just how many gaps there are in, our decision making. I mean, I was thinking for myself, I have a advanced directive. That's my job. That's all I need to know. And so anyway, I just find it very fascinating and so much to learn. When you moved from there to the Department of Homelessness, what was the biggest surprise to you? What was the thing that you were first challenged with and also, found a great opportunity?
I mean, I think the biggest challenge was the sheer complexity of a new system. And, like every system, this system has a huge number of acronyms and things to learn. Funding sources and, braiding them all together is really the challenge. There's not enough money, unfortunately, in San Francisco to really to really provide housing for every single person who needs it. And it's kind of like it's its whole system with coordinated entry and different funding sources that can serve different populations, and you've got to weave all that together to make a system that at least flows for the people who need it. And so I don't know if that was a surprise, but it was, I think, a surprise for me that it was as foreign a system as like the stuff I had to deal with before. I felt like, okay, I have this pretty long history of working in government, and I got there and I was like, ugh, this is a whole new thing, whole new language, all of that. And so that was a bit of a surprise.
I would say, I mean, being within one organization and having completely different systems and different departments. What are some of the things that you're most proud of that you did in the Department of Homelessness?
I think there are a few things. One of them is we created a new strategic plan that really focused on better serving people experiencing chronic homelessness and cutting that number in half, reducing the number of people experiencing homelessness by 15%. But within that, we really embedded a lot of equity work. And while the strategic plan itself is not ever something you want to talk about that much in a podcast, it actually, what I feel good about is that has really helped our department focus on some very much needed areas that we all needed to focus on. I think there was a lot of just disparate actions happening when I got there, and people not understanding the vision and kind of the direction that the department wanted to go. And that was for a couple of different reasons. I mean, it's a fairly new department. It wasn't well-resourced at the beginning, had several different leaders. COVID happened. There are all sorts of reasons. But I feel really good about, starting to kind of turn the ship and get people coordinated in moving in the same direction. So we've been able to really increase the number of shelter beds that we have in the city available to people who need them. We've really been able to increase the number of supportive housing units that we have. On any given night at this point, we're housing almost 17,500 people. And that's the most resourced we've ever been in the city to serve this population. So I feel really good about that. And we know that we need more, and we know that we need to find more ways to help people move out of this system and into affordable housing or on with their lives, career-wise. I mean, we're partnering with other systems like workforce development and behavioral health and the affordable housing system. So that's always important. But I do feel like we've gotten, we've had, I think the number is 20,000 people have new housing since 2018. And so despite what you see on the street in San Francisco a lot of times, and despite the fact that I think what people see and think of as homelessness is often, a mix of things. It's not always homelessness. It's drug use, addiction issues. It's behavioral health issues in general. We have done a really good job of getting a lot of folks off the street. We can't shred the flow, unfortunately, and that homelessness continues to be an issue in our country because we need better policies at the national level, but we have continually housed more and more people in our system.
I want to ask you just to give us a description. I think when I was at Glide, one of the things I also learned was about supportive housing and how important supportive housing is. And I believe that is one of the largest solutions to homelessness issues. And so if you could just explain what supportive housing is, I think that would be really helpful for some people who don't understand that.
Sure. So supportive housing is a proven best practice which provides housing for people who've been underhoused often throughout their lives, and provides supportive services to help them remain stable in that housing. And those supportive services, can be in the form of case management, where somebody's working with a resident to help them kind of achieve their goals. And their goals could be getting back into the workforce. It could be completing a degree. It could be, just living without losing their housing and, accessing mental health care. It could mean a lot of those things, but there are people with, disabling conditions or people who have a history of being underhoused or unhoused who really need those services to be able to maintain their housing. And that's really what it's about. And that's the same intervention that's used across the country.
I'm so admiring, Shireen, of the work you've done as head of several departments in the city. But I'm really curious, and I want to put you on the spot. What makes you the kind of leader who achieves the results that you've just described about the Department of Homelessness and Supportive Housing? Like, what do you uniquely bring to the equation?
I mean, I think what I hear my staff say to me, especially those closest to me, is that I'm very calm. I do not, I really try to hear where my staff are on any given day and understand what they need from me. And I try really hard to build teams that do the same thing, right? So they don't have to be calm because I really am calm. Like I very rarely lose it or raise my voice or any of those things. That's just who I am. But that people really think about what their staff need, like, and how to get them the tools. And I try to teach, the folks on my deputy director, my exec team, that's actually our role. Our role is to get the staff what they need so that we can all be doing the job that we need to be doing. And, our job is not to yell at them or put pressure on them or react to the political environment that we're in every day, because this is a really tough environment for everyone. If you look at any San Francisco newspaper, you're going to see our department's name in there and how we're screwing up, right? That's kind of the environment that we're in. And so we have to really keep the shield, as the executive leadership. I have to keep that and try to just say to my staff, what we have to focus on is the task at hand. And I'm here to get you what you need. And, that's not always easy when you've got a bunch of people, between the mayor's office and the board of supervisors and all the people who don't want homelessness in their backyard and people experiencing homelessness who don't like something and are upset about it and our providers who didn't get paid. It's just there's just this constant chaos. And so it's finding that quiet in the chaos and trying to hold that space for staff. And it's not always easy and I'm not always successful at it, but that to me is the only way to work in this environment and to move forward.
Yeah. You said earlier, very early on in this conversation, that you were proud to be able to shape the work. And I think it was about a different department, but it strikes me as you talk about what you bring to the position, that shapes the work almost more than the policies and the strategic plan that you come up with. Your approach as a human to your team and thinking about what they need, both from a resource perspective, but from a human to human perspective, to me is a way of shaping the work that transcends function. It transcends systems. It somehow, sometimes it results in magic, but it's shaping the work at the executive level. You're setting the tone. I'm just sort of thinking out loud as in response to what you've said. But it strikes me as being so important to think about that as a leader explicitly, intentionally. Like, what am I bringing to the table? Okay, another question that I must ask. What kind of boss helps you show up at your best? And obviously, in your world, it might be a little different than other people, but I'm still going to ask the question.
I mean, that's a good question. And yes, in my world, it's different because, because my boss, at least right now, is the mayor and that's been my reality for the past 8 years or something like that. or maybe longer. So, I think it's somebody who really just lets me do my thing. I am a department head in this particular role. And so I think that's the most important thing is my job is to really pull together the staff, obviously to get direction from the mayor. Like the mayor wants to, for example, the mayor-elect really wants to, or has made a campaign promise to add 1,500 new shelter beds in the first 6 months. My job then is to figure out, along with the mayor's office, like what that looks like and how to make that a reality. So that's a very clear direction, and it's actually very helpful because it's very clear. I think that our role though as a department is also to say, okay, we have a planning function. We go out and we figure out what this project should look like. We map it out, and if we see problems with it or see something that might not work right, my job is then to take that back. And it's very helpful to have a boss who says, okay, well then let's pivot and figure out how do we still get what I need and, but not put you in a box where you can't, achieve what we all need to achieve together. And that's sometimes hard when you're in a political environment because there are just so many political factors fighting with each other, and you have to figure out what the best path forward is. And I think, so I would say, I guess the best boss for me to work with is somebody who understands all of those factors for themselves as well as for me and for other department heads, because, we're very rarely working in a vacuum. It's usually with the Department of Public Works or the Department of Public Health or, a number of others. And so it's knowing that we all have our own areas of expertise. And because we don't work in a vacuum, every one of us is going to be giving up a little bit to make something happen. And, what mayors, I think, realize that sometimes right away and sometimes after they've been in the job for a while. Okay, we're not going to be able to do exactly the way I wanted to do it, but let's figure out how to get as close as we can, or to make it work in a different way.
Yeah. It's reminding me, Juliet, of your philosophy. And I'm just going to point to you. Would you say what that is? I hope you know what I'm talking about.
My philosophy?
Your philosophy of leadership is you say, yes, and.
And, yes, and, right.
Yes, and we can't exactly do it that way because X, Y, or Z. Or yes, and, right? To navigate.
Yeah, so to me, I don't start with no, I start with yes, and here's the consequences of the thing that you're asking me to do. Does that still work? Because I think that leaders, and often when you're at a level in an organization, you are put in situations, and it's not just in government, but it's in other situations of, I want this thing to happen, go make it happen. And, without knowing all the pieces of the puzzle. So I've worked for a lot of CEOs who are aspirational, who want, to make big sweeping change or something new to come on. And it's okay, but you haven't really learned how the system works now. And if you don't want to learn how the system works now, you can't quite, you're not always going to be able, it's not a clear path to go from one thing to another. So I think that being able to say yes and help understand what the consequences of the action is makes a difference in your conversation. I think it is also, I really want to highlight a couple things that you said, Shireen. One is that ability to compromise and find that common ground is I think, an early leadership challenge, to accept that you're not going to get 100% of what you want, and just being able to live with it and feel proud of the work you're doing in spite of it or because of it, I think is super important. And then the other thing is finding quiet in the chaos. I just see that as such an important success measure. If you can find that quiet in chaos, I think that's something that really is a really incredible leadership quality. So I just want to point that out. And I want to ask you the key question, of course, for the podcast, which is, what are the secrets that you found there?
I mean, I think one of the things is, for me, is I was a very shy, very, very, very shy, very quiet. I'm still quiet in some ways, but like child and then young adult, and didn't like conflict. And I think, when you're in a leadership role, you're naturally going to face conflict, and you have to actually dive into conflict sometimes because you have to be the leader. And I found that, even in really, really difficult situations, I have gotten to the point where I often have the answers, and I think something is going to be a huge challenge, or some conflict's going to be a huge challenge, and then I can walk away from it and go home and go to bed or whatever, and wake up and realize, I actually have the answer to this, and I can actually lean into this conflict or this, and talk through it with somebody, and I'm fine doing that. And to me, that's really important for every leader to understand. There are ways to do that without losing the other person or making the situation worse. But it's having the confidence to be able to do that and to have conversations that are difficult. And, that's ultimately what people are asking you to do. I mean, I think another thing that I learned early on is that people want a decision, and, it doesn't matter if it's the absolute right decision. It's probably not going to be. It never is, but sometimes it's just not, right? But if it's the best decision that you can make at the time, given the information you have, it's really what people need. And later you can come back and go, well, we could have done this differently. But if you just don't let yourself move forward, because you're, it's kind of like perfect is the enemy of good. You waste time, and you often don't come to a better decision anyway, right? So those things I think are really important to remember, pretty much in every situation.
I've decided, Shireen, that I'm going to adopt, probably for my mantra in January 2025, is find or be the quiet in the chaos, because, oh my gosh, does that speak to me? Really, really admire that. I want to, you mentioned something about being in conflict and then, being able to go home and then waking up the next morning and seeing a path forward. So I want to kind of focus on the walking away part. How do you take care of yourself? You've described a job that is complex at the nth degree. It's big, it's challenging, it takes a lot of heart and brains. What do you do at the end of the day, and how do you keep your own stamina and sense of forward motion going?
I'm really fortunate that I have, a very caring and loving partner, who has just really stepped into finding ways for us to have fun. And we do a lot of that. I mean, and it's not just the two of us. I mean, I have a really, really strong group of friends and a strong community. And that's really what sustains me. I mean, I have I have a very active social life, just being able to hang out with people in my neighborhood, in our neighborhood, with work colleagues. I have a group of work colleagues I get together with who we don't even all work together, but we know each other because of work, right? And so we get together regularly, and we have a text thread, that we're on all the time, where we support each other. I think, and so those things have been really important to me over the past few years, because this job has been really, really difficult at many times. And then just being able to be physically active. I mean, I love being in the Bay Area because there's so many places to go out and just get outside of the city. And I do that really regularly, because to me, that nature is another way for me to kind of, regroup and be able to come back and deal with it again. I don't always look forward to Mondays, but
Let me ask you this one question. I was just signaling to Juliet, but because we probably need to wrap in the next few minutes at least. But do you get the Sunday scaries?
That happens occasionally, not that much. That's the other thing I realized is the mayor-elect asked me last week, what are 3 things you're afraid I'll do? And I was like, I'm not really afraid of anything you'll do. We're concerned about a lot of things at this point. And so I don't know that I have that Sunday scaries as much. I think a lot about what needs to happen during the week. I review my schedule and like what are the days that are going to be more challenging to me that I do? Like, oh, I have to meet with the boss. Like, that's always a thing to think about. Like, what am I going to, what exactly, how do I tell her the things that, I need to tell her in the very short time that I have, what's going to be important to her, it's a different thinking. And so I do have that on Sundays. But I've kind of ceased, I think, to be shocked by anything or to be like overwhelmed by anything because this job is so overwhelming in so many ways that I could let that get the best of me. And I just decided I can't go there.
Yeah. You know what it sounds like to me, Shireen, if you allow me to say this, it sounds like you don't take things personally anymore.
Yeah, I try really hard not to. And for the most part, I don't. I actually don't.
Yeah. My own experience and in talking to people about the Sunday scaries is there's some part of us that seizes up because it's going to negatively reflect on us or something bad will happen to us like, oh my God, we'll get fired. And, most of it is drama in our heads. But
right.
to be confident that you can show up and do your job, but not personalize the environment around you is a remarkable gift. Quiet in the chaos.
I love it. Well, thank you, Shireen, so much for being with us on our as our first guest of season 2, which is very exciting. And it's just been a education to talk to you, and I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that you actually asked me to be on this podcast because it seems pretty great what you're doing and lifting up those little women.
I want to jump in with an editorial comment. Orders on we weren't going to talk about anything politics with a capital P, but I just want to say, as I've gotten to know you, and this is the first time I've had a chance to talk with you and face to face, however virtual, you're really impressive. And it makes me think proudly of civil servants and public servants working for the city and working on behalf of all of us, but especially the most vulnerable. And I say that with a certain amount of passion because I see how often public service, civic service is denigrated, and it makes me crazy. And when you meet someone like you who's doing a really big job and bringing so much to the table and making the kind of difference that you are, it's just, yeah, that's all I have to say. I'm losing my words here, but I did want to say thank you for being who you are in a really tough job in a challenging city, because you seem to be doing exactly what we would want the best of our civil servants, public servants to be doing.
Agree. Yeah, Shireen, this conversation was very helpful for me, and I appreciate it so much.
We're so glad you've joined us for this episode of Secrets of the C-Suite, the podcast. We'll be back with another episode in 2 weeks. In the meantime, please tell your friends and coworkers about us, and be sure to follow, subscribe, and give us a 5-star rating if you enjoyed listening. Secrets of the C-Suite is produced by Juliet Clothier, Susan Sutherland, and Brian Clothier. Original music is by Brian Clothier. And the podcast is inspired by leaders like you.